I do hope that we get something. It'd be nice if we got snow, just because it's such a rare thing.
Yeah, one of my friends had shared one of the newscasts. I guess they said that even into Thursday, we could be getting another round of snow. So I don't know. I'm thinking, are we going to be home all week?
That's nice. Well,
Wow.
true.
I don't know about that. Aren't we just back to everybody kind of getting out again?
Not us.
Oh, yeah, no.
That's true. All right, so we're live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Dyslexia Coffee Talk. I'm your host, Ashley Roberts, and we have a very special guest for you today. We are talking with Amy Trainer about a parent's perspective on due process. It's part of our rights under IDEA in order to pursue rectifying the situation for our children. And Amy has graciously agreed to talk to us today. So, hey, Amy.
Good morning. Good morning.
Oh, and if you heard us, we were chit-chatting about the snow. We may or may not get
some crazy flakes for
I
sure.
know.
Nice.
I like all the memes that are saying, hey, all my northern friends, come down to Texas and get your weather. It's drunk in my backyard.
Absolutely. And I was laying in bed last night hearing like just even the beginnings of the wind, and it just sounds cold. And I'm thinking this is about as warm as it's going to be until what, next Friday, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
For our area, that's a lot.
So let's get started. Let's talk about, we won't say your child's name or anything like that, but let's talk about, how many years was your child in public school? And more to that, like when did, what grade was your child when you first started to suspect that there might be struggles with reading?
So she actually in kindergarten, we made it about 6 weeks before the kindergarten teacher was giving us that first parent teacher conference and the heads up of, I think maybe we should think about RTI. Literacy concepts are just not catching on. Like, she's a math whiz. So her numeracy concepts were just clicking away and really ahead. And now that I know a little bit more about dyslexia at this point of the game, she really had indications in preschool that even the preschool teachers and we just didn't know enough to know that that's what we were looking at. We probably could have saved a lot of time and effort on the front side had we known, but really it was right at the beginning of our kindergarten year that we knew that there was going to be maybe some literacy needs.
So definitely the screening law would have benefited, but let's talk about if it had been in place then, which it wasn't, but what grade is your child in now?
So she's in 5th now. So we hobbled through public school for, including kindergarten, 5 years. So all the way through 4th grade.
At what point sort of in the public school years where did that sort of this isn't working kind of point come from? You know what I mean? I mean, obviously they started you off with RTI, but did you ever progress to a 504, an IEP? Sort of where were those points, and where were you and your husband finally at the point where you're like, this is not working?
So it just, in full disclosure, because we know each other, but a lot of people don't know my professional background, and so I'm actually in public education, or I was in public education supporting kids with diverse learning needs as a therapist and assistive technology practitioner. And so my level of comfort and trust was different. I think I hate to think that I will trust less easily now, but that was definitely a stumbling block for us because I had a lot more faith in the system, that there were people doing right by my kid the way that I was functioning on behalf of other students. And so I feel a lot of personal kind of guilt and remorse for being trusting and thinking that things were happening for my child when they weren't. But I should have known to stop the RTI process, stop it, but to ask for an evaluation sooner than I did. But definitely by the time I got the call about we're at risk for retention in kindergarten because of literacy. At the same time that they're also doing a gifted and talented screening because she is so bright, right? It's all happening at the same time. And had I known then what I know now, I would have said, wait, we need a bigger picture assessment than just a gifted and talented screening. We need a whole picture and see where these holes really are. But it was truly once we started first grade, when first grade was started without any support, the way that we had daily RTI all the way
Mhm.
through kindergarten, right? And so then we start first grade and parent teacher conference comes around. Oh, we're not at level, we're at tier 2 and all this, but no mention at that point of any support. And I didn't because I trusted
Mhm.
that the experts had the handle on it. But then by about Christmas that year, later in the year, her math grades were falling and she was refusing to cooperate, which was not my sweet's disposition at all. And so I knew that we had a bigger challenge ahead of us.
Were you able to progress to, what did you progress to, a 504 or an IEP? Or was there a stair step in there?
Well, I wasn't going to fool around with a 504, just with my knowledge and experience with law. And providing special education support, that I knew that there was not really a need to mess with a 504. That wasn't where we were at that point. And so I just went full hog and requested the FIE. And of course, they look like me, like I had 6 heads, because she is a bright, amazing kid.
Mhm.
And they were not seeing the struggles necessarily because we were seeing them at home, despite her grades falling, despite all these other things that we were seeing. They were not significant. She wasn't failing, but it wasn't her level of performance, and they were definitely falling
Mhm.
as they related to literacy. So that's what we did. We requested the FIE. They looked at me like I had 6 heads. They begrudgingly did it because they had to. It was in writing. So, but then they denied her. So just the evaluation was not fabulous. There was lots of holes in it, and there were some areas of concern, but because the teacher had said, oh, everything's fine in the classroom, everything was fine. And so that led to our initial the initial review was a disagreement. I wasn't going to go with that. And so we went ahead with an IEE. So things were always a little bit challenging from the beginning. Had a year with an amazing teacher. Our second grade teacher was heaven sent for sure. We call her our what is the Polanco book now? Fokker, Mr. Fokker. We call her Mr. Fokker, and she was like, we gave her the book, and she made me cry, and she worked so hard with us together
Mhm.
that it was an amazing year. And then that was a great year, but that was about the only one that was fabulous. Kindergarten was great, and second grade was great, but the other years were very challenging.
So, because our audience is kind of wide, FIE is a very Texas-based term. So what it means is full individual evaluation. It's the IDEA evaluation for everybody outside of Texas.
Sorry about that. I speak Texas through and through.
I know, so do I. An IEE, I think, is a pretty universal term, but just for everybody else, it's independent educational evaluation. So it's the protest that you basically get, the protest evaluation, if you want, off of the initial independent evaluation that you get from the school if you disagree with their findings.
Yeah, it's your second opinion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's anything that the school evaluates, you can have one done outside the school as well at public expense.
Yes. Good point. So you did the IEE, they granted you the IEP after that?
They did grant me the IEE, and they filed her folder into D&Q and plopped it away wherever wherever that goes into Never Never Land. And we proceeded with procuring the IEE. That's not a fast and easy process if anybody has ever done that, because a lot of times the providers that the district have kind of on their approved list either aren't always accessible, or you may want to think twice about providing, getting your kids' IEE done on an already pre-approved vendor list. May not be as independent as you would like.
Right.
So finding that and finding someone who would agree to the pittance that they would pay for the, it's not fast. So it took a while is what I'm saying. And so by the time we were actually in the IE process and getting that taken care of, we were starting second grade. So it took um, our
That's a
disagreement.
long time.
Our disagreement was in the spring, right around probably spring break of first grade.
Okay.
So it took a while to get the IEE approved and then the whole process. And then I mean, it's summer, right? Like,
right.
I probably could have done a little bit more over the summer, but moms.
It's summer.
It's summer. My poor kid is like struggling, so I'm not going to do that to her either, right? So there's that mental health balance. But so we're doing the IEE process, and our amazing second grade teacher calls me right from the beginning. I mean, we may not have made it in 2 or 3 weeks, and is freaking out legit about literacy levels. And I said, I'm so thankful that you called, and I'm thankful that you recognize this, because here's where we are. She had no idea that all of this was going on with IEE and the referral, because the file was on a shelf somewhere in some other building. They washed their hands of being concerned of it, I think. Mm-hmm. But now, because she was concerned, it escalated the campus's concerned a little bit. They couldn't shove it off as easily.
Right.
So we got the IE done. Definitely had 3 areas of SLD and reading according to that, and dyslexia. Came back, the district wanted to do more testing. I mean, so we're like totally lengthening out this whole child find responsibility. So it's crazy. And I'm like, no, 2 weeks. If you want some more numbers, you can have them in 2 weeks. We're not playing this game anymore, because she's struggling and school is no fun for her anymore. So that was a long process. So really we did end up with an IEP about 2 years after we started the whole recognizing there was a problem in kindergarten. So 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you said D and Q earlier.
Yep. The D and Q did not qualify. So when they did her initial evaluation, even though there were sub-scores that were concerning and depressed, especially related to her cognitive functioning, they said no, because she was fine in the classroom, according to the teacher, there was no problem.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunate story that a lot of us hear, right?
That's what I say frequently talking to parents. I'm like, it's the same story with a different kid and a different parent name.
Yeah. So this is a question I sort of like to ask parents when I talk to them, because every parent's at a different place. Like you said, you were a public education professional, you're an OT, ATP. Was dyslexia something that you felt like you understood really well, or through this journey with your child, is dyslexia something that you feel like you've learned a great deal more about?
Definitely. We've all learned a lot, right? We all become dyslexia experts pretty much overnight when you have to. But, I did have a level of knowledge that was different, I know, than the typical parent, but it wasn't necessarily to the cognitive process of reading. Mm-hmm. It was more in how to support students doing what they need to do at school. So identifying the holes and being able to support those while the supposed instruction is taking place. Mm-hmm. And supporting a kid to function and participate. Definitely, I think it helped, or it has helped, just in my knowledge of the evidence that's required for a therapeutic intervention, mm-hmm. and how that should translate to instructional practices. Whether it does or not doesn't, that's up to question a lot of times. But that I think was one of my big red flags professionally, was how could the expectation for me as a therapist mm-hmm. differ so significantly under the same law, under the same guiding principles, if you will, as for my child's, for her education. So that's been a big battle for me personally, trying to kind of right that ship.
Yeah, definitely. So she's in second grade. It was a 2-year journey to get to the IEP. Where are you in second grade when you got the IEP? Like mid-year, early?
It was right at Thanksgiving. So right at Thanksgiving, we got the IEP, started dyslexia. Jen had dyslexia.
Right.
and had an IEP.
Okay. Did she start to progress, or so forgive me if I'm wrong. I think you began the due process at the beginning of last school year, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that would have been the beginning of her fourth grade year.
Right.
So you've got an almost, but not quite full 2-year gap between you get the IEP and you begin the due process filing.
Right.
What kind of happened in that almost 2-year time frame that you felt like things weren't working the way that they should have been? I mean, you've already talked about, of course, the difference in the therapy levels, of course.
Right. I think the real difference for us was truly our general education teacher,
Mhm.
especially in second grade, because she was a phonics kind of old school teacher and taught the way we all learned how to read, right? It was a phonics. And so she was so vested in my daughter's success. I mean, she was heavily invested. There was nothing she wasn't going to do, nothing she wouldn't do to help her succeed. And so I accredit a lot of the growth. We did see good growth in second grade because of her,
Mhm.
but that's where it ended. Third grade was a waste. Her IEP actually had documented regression. That it baffles me that that's even tolerated. So third grade, while she was happy because her teachers, that's the other thing. I mean, our teachers, we never had teachers that I didn't feel like didn't care about
Mhm.
her, and they weren't ugly ever.
Mhm.
To where I hear horror stories from people about, the ways their kids have been treated because they struggle.
Mhm.
And that was not ever our experience. We had great teachers that truly did care. They were unsupported and not properly trained to be doing what we needed to have done.
Right.
But third grade was a total waste. We made clearly no progress at all. And then by fourth grade, when I'm recognizing the problem of third grade and that nobody thought to provide any extra support when we're regressing, all of these things, and I'm asking for extra support and hearing, oh gosh, that, we're not worried about that now. We can't ask for ESY now. That was in the past. And it was just totally mind blowing to me that this was their, the responsibility of the LEA, right? The educational
Mhm.
agency to do these things. And it was a total breach of contract, right? Like nothing
Right.
happened the way it was supposed to happen. And I'm thinking, God, and so I start asking for more support. I never went into any of our meetings ugly or hostile or never had an advocate because I didn't feel like we needed one. We had great working relationships, I thought,
Mhm.
you know. Um, and so it didn't start off like it finished, right? Like you finished with the tone of due process in your mouth. It was never that way.
Right.
Um, it was always cordial. But I think that was when I really realized I was like, oh. So I asked for help. I asked for help from our administrator. Like, here we have this great guidance about what the IEP needs to look like for a kid with dyslexia. Had been out from our education agency for a while. She'd never
Mhm.
seen it. Never seen it. Like, oh, well, I shouldn't be the first one to show this to you, but here you go. And that was that, lots of things. Then I think that the final straw was it took us about 8 to 10 weeks from the initial annual date to kind of come up with something a pill we could swallow as far as agreeing, because I didn't agree with the plan that they were proposing, that it wasn't going to close the gaps that were created in the year prior, and certainly not anywhere near what she needed to be doing to prepare for fourth and fifth and on.
Mhm.
And so I'd asked an instructional officer, somebody in our administration, I said, please, could you please come help, thinking that this was just a dialogue problem. I'm not,
Right.
I'm not expressing myself correctly. I don't know what's going on. Can you come help? And I realized that when she came and helped facilitate writing an IEP to use accommodations instead of actually learning and instruction, I thought, oh, this is not this is not going well. And that was kind of my big point of like, okay, well, I have tried everything I know, and I do not want to have to go through due process. And that was really the last straw. But I knew that we were going to have to do something pretty major.
Yeah. So that was a question I wanted to ask you, because I think due process is a thing that impacts an entire family, right? Everybody in your family is invested in what's actually happening. So can you tell me a little bit maybe about how y'all came to the decision? Was it just you and your husband? Did you discuss it with your children? Were they a part of the decision-making process? Were they informed? Kind of how did that dynamic work?
It was definitely a conversation for quite a while between my husband and I initially. We talk a lot with our kids about and make decisions as a family with all of us. So we definitely addressed it with them, with our oldest, who is 4 years older, who's still in the schools, was going to possibly impact him.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely with our daughter, who it was impacting the most, and really involving her to the point of helping her. School became traumatic to her, right? Like it was an awful experience for us. COVID happening and schools closing was such a blessing, because I could say, you never have to go back there again. I don't know what we're going to do, but I am not going to send you back there where the whole experience is traumatizing. You don't have to go back. So we had been, reassuring her that what her experience wasn't her fault,
Mm-hmm.
and she was doing everything that she could do. We were trying to make this right by her, which is why we involved her in some of the conversation. Once we had it kind of thought through enough that we were like, okay, we know you don't have to go back. You can be a part of the conversation of what's next. Are we going to homeschool? We're going to private school. What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
That was where we were involving her. And then when it really came to the decision about due process with her, are you okay if we do this? Are you okay if we make it public? Because professionally, I knew that the cards are not in a parent's favor ever,
Right.
and especially here, right? And we know that, and we knew that going in. But what my purpose in the whole thing was really to help kind of bring light to what was going on and helping other parents understand whether we prevailed or not. I mean, that we should have prevailed, but whether we prevailed or not, it gave us an opportunity and a platform to be able to share what I knew professionally and what I had experienced as a parent, and help other parents see in their own child's experience what they could be facilitating for better results for them.
Right. So you make the decision as a family. You move forward with filing due process. Let's talk about the preparation process.
Uh,
I know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you choose an attorney, but I think that this is sort of the thing that a lot of people don't understand, especially about due process. They think that you just file and then there's some meetings potentially, or because not a whole lot of families go all the way to due process, right? So what is it like to go through that preparation? I mean, I know what you went through.
You do. So I think it helps if you're organized from the beginning, because while we asked for the records request, the educational records request from the district, just on the chance that there was anything that we didn't already have, I had already maintained pretty impeccable records, to be able to know and to be able to see what was going on. And I think when you make the decision to go through due process, you have to have data that supports, because you have to prove without a shadow of a doubt and then some, right, that there was any wrongdoing. And so I think a lot of families get caught in what they want for their kid, and is this as well as they could have done. And I know as dyslexia families, that's something we all struggle with, because our kids by and large are highly capable and highly intelligent, and we see districts that are okay with that achievement gap.
Right.
And I think that sometimes parents can want that. We all want that, right? I'm not, but as far as the public school's responsibility is not to meet that high level of achievement that's
Mhm.
been established, right? And that's what you get caught up on emotionally. But you have to have the data that supports the lack of implementation or whatever. Like, what are the real holes um, in doing that? So having the records, having the whole thing really already laid out before you have an attorney is what you're going to have to do if you go that route. And really, when you're considering that, for us, um, there was only one option that was going to make any sense, and that was private school. So that was the relief that we requested. I think that doesn't always bode well in a hearing officer's decision-making process because of the expense and because of kind of the Pandora's box that opens.
Right.
I think that if you're okay in the decision-making process and the thought process that the relief that you're going to request can be provided and implemented at the district level, you have a greater chance of prevailing, right?
Mhm.
Because just the expense alone is easier to swallow. The pill is easier to swallow for the educational agency
Mhm.
and the state.
So, I mean, you said a lot in that, and that was an incredibly awesome response. Let's talk
All right.
about showing some of,
Yeah,
huh?
dissect it down, make me go back.
No, no, no. Let's talk about like showing those gaps, like you mean. When I think when you've got a 504, it's definitely harder to be able to show those gaps necessarily because you don't have the breadth of evaluations potentially. One thing that I gleaned from your due process was, all of these teachers' reports versus actual hard data. So, in the world that I exist in from a business perspective, we wouldn't even call that apples to oranges. That's like apples to llamas. So where they're
Double
not
up
even,
mamas.
yeah, I know. Well, they're not even in the same,
Not in the same thing.
scientific category.
Right.
So how do you glean how do you glean the data necessary in order to show, with an average or above average IQ, whatever it is, the child should, it's not unrealistic to say that the child should be achieving grade level. And not only are they not achieving grade level, but in the case of your daughter, she was regressing beyond that as well. So, which means she made gains and then she's falling backwards. So, I mean, what would you recommend to parents that are considering due process and how to necessarily show that delta?
I think that at this point, I would tell any parent starting kindergarten to read whatever procedural safeguards and whatever process, like special ed process guide for parents, whatever your state has, should be required reading for incoming kindergartners.
Mhm.
Because nobody starts kindergarten, nobody starts school unless you've been provided, early childhood intervention, unless you have an obvious outside the box learning need, right? You
Mhm.
don't necessarily start kindergarten thinking that you've got dyslexia or thinking any of these things. And you really have to be prepared for this end game from day one,
Yeah.
because looking back, I think, God, if I would have just done this or, kept on them about this or whatever, I think my biggest thing would be to, if you can, if
Mhm.
you're at all concerned about your kiddos' learning needs, to have some objective progress monitoring. I know with reading, with literacy, that's easy. You can do easy CBN, you can do doubles, you can do all these things that don't require a teacher necessarily to facilitate and do. You could hire somebody or find someone to do some progress monitoring and benchmarking outside of your child's 504 or IEP. I would totally do that again in a heartbeat.
Mhm.
Like I said at the beginning, I trusted.
Mhm.
I trusted that there would be data to reflect upon, when in fact, when we're in due process hearing, we're hearing the testimony that the data was in the shred box. So there was no even data to go back and look upon for this regression. So yeah, so I think that would be one of the big things. Just assume that if you don't ever have to need to know the SPED process, then you're great. but learning it when you're in the throes of it, time is of the essence, right? Time is never in the favor of the child or the family.
Right.
And so I think knowledge is power, and being able to plug in, right? Making sure that, I think because of our generation, the way that special education and learning differences were stigmatized,
Yeah.
if you will. I mean, I remember in elementary school, there was 2 classes and they were at the end of the hall, and there was no integration, and it was not what it should have been at all, but that changed the way we all think about it, right? It just does. So I think it takes a lot of parental mindset, willpower, if you will, to be willing to talk about it, because you're not alone. You and your kid are not alone. And I think the more you can be relatable and help with somebody else, and being open to asking for help too, right? Being able to connect. So some of those kinds of things, hindsight being 2020, from the beginning, plugging in, being more knowledgeable about the process, and having that outside benchmarking, if you will, and data collection, I think would have made it a little bit easier. And definitely knowing the data collection that is taking place in the school, what that looks like, how it's done, and making sure that you have your hands on it in the moment.
Right. But I think that that's like, those are important call outs. And I don't know from a parent perspective with like what we're doing with DI and trying to educate and empower people. I don't know that that's something, off the top of my head, I think that that's going to be one of our greatest struggles is how do you educate parents going into school about the SPED process, because it is such a daunting process. I know, like you said, with our generation, it was such a stigmatized thing. And I know when I pursued SPED for my own child, I didn't really know anybody. I wasn't really tapped into the community. I had just heard that this is what I needed to do if I really wanted to get more for what he needed and give myself more teeth within the process, right? So I pursued this thing without really kind of understanding the whole ramification of what I was pursuing, both positive and negative. And I remember I got it, and I was so terrified to come home and tell my husband, by the way, honey, I've just classed our kid as SPED. Just terrified of that conversation because, he's 4 years older than I am. He's part of the same, or he was part of that same educational, what's the word that I want?
Dynamic. I mean, it was just the scene. It was the landscape. It was
right. It was that educational segregation that existed between SPED and non-SPED, right? So I was terrified to tell him. And I remember, I think I drank a glass of wine and I worked up the courage and I looked at him and I said, honey, so this is the thing that I've done.
Forgiveness, not permission. That's my kind of girl.
Yeah, no, I never asked for permission. I just asked for forgiveness.
All the things.
But, I was prepared for fireworks, and he just turned around and he said the most wonderful thing that I think he could ever possibly say, which he said, our son learns in a very specific way. So of course he needs to be taught in a very specific way. And if that's special education, then that's special education. Not knowing, like I know now, like now, all SPED parents know now about how special education was completely redone. Just so it's not the same thing that it was before. It's a completely different thing. And I have people question me about, why would I do that to my son? Because they're from a generation that was the stigma. And they're like, well, are you going to take him off before he graduates from high school so that he doesn't have to have that on his diploma? And I'm like, wow, you really?
It's just a lack of knowledge,
Right.
It's something, and that's where that when parents can have those conversations and be comfortable with it, it helps change the mindset
Right.
for everybody's experience, right? Because, I think it should also be mentioned too in this whole what our experience was growing up is that literacy was also taught the way science says literacy should be taught. And so we didn't have the difficulties, I am quite confident that what we have experienced
Mm-hmm.
would have maybe not even been a real issue
Great.
had gen ed curriculum and instruction been done the way that we all had it done, the way that we were taught to read by the science of reading, the way the brain learns to read versus guessing, actual decoding and encoding versus what do you think? It looks good to me.
Yeah.
Would change the song completely.
Sometimes I wish my grandmother was still alive because she was a teacher. She actually had a master's in education. She got her master's in education in the 60s. She's from rural Arkansas and she goes and gets a master's in education, which I just think is amazing. I A lot of me wishes she was still alive because I would love to interview her on this subject more than anything else, because I think if she knew, it would be devastating to
Yeah. So
her in so many ways.
yeah. And so she was literature, English language arts, high school principal certification, like all the things. So I was like, that public education is my jam, right? That should be where everybody learns. And so that was a big hurdle for us. For me personally, was making that shift to private and knowing that was really our only answer at the time. It was painful, right? It was very painful to me to have that like real reality. But yeah, so my mom, I'm thinking, gosh, if she passed away when I was pregnant with Olivia. So I'm like, oh my gosh, mom, you could have totally done this whole thing, would never have had this problem because she would have known how to do it. But these are the life curves that you get. But yeah, I think that goes without saying, is that the way that we were all taught was totally different than what's historically what our kids have been doing. Hopefully we're seeing some of that change. And our grandkids will be taught the way that we were, maybe.
We can hope, right?
We can work. That's what we're working on, right? So somebody's got to read.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the hearing process. You opted for a public hearing, which was amazingly brave. And I loved how advocates across the entire country were watching and commenting throughout all that. Like, especially all the, oh, hell no comments at different points. Those
She
were
did
definitely
not.
good.
Yeah.
Wait, she just said what?
The shred box?
So tell me what it was like because it was a 3-day hearing.
Mhm.
It's pretty much all day long for 3 straight days, right?
Yeah.
What was it like to go through the hearing process?
Exhausting. I mean, that goes without saying, right?
Right.
Fortunately or unfortunately, because of all of this, we were virtual. And so I only had to meander out to the dining room, and it wasn't quite as emotionally taxing to get to a location and all of that. So I think that
To
was
be more on because you're
yeah,
in
to
front
be
of
more on, although I am much more effective in person. So I think that was kind of a demise.
Yeah.
But just to have the opportunity for so many people to partake and to be able to watch, that was a huge blessing, because um, that many people would not have benefited from our experience, even in an open hearing, if it would have been at an admin building, right? We could not have had the reach that we had, which was crazy to see the numbers of people that watched while the videos were still live.
Mm-hmm.
It would not have been possible. So that was exhausting. I think at this point, the most troubling to me about the experience of the hearing is that the burden of proof is on the family, right? The parents have to prove, even when you have all the data, you have to prove and keep proving where there was a wrong, if there was, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you're leading into this whole thing, I mean, we all have been at the table, right? Whether you're at a 504 table or an IEP table, in most instances, it's not truly a partnership, right? IDEA wants it to be, and that's why we're named first. Parents are expected to be the expert,
Mm-hmm.
respected as such, and we know that doesn't happen.
Right.
So you're already up against that, but you finally, I think I finally felt, oh my gosh, this is my chance. This is my hearing. This is my opportunity to put it all out there. And it was still not equitable. It was still the way that our hearing officer divided out the time, divided out the opportunity, I thought, this is on my dime, right? Like, I'm the one having to foot the bill for the attorney. I'm the one having to foot the bill for the expert testimony,
Mhm.
being out of work, all of the other things that go into this. And and she shot the time so unfavorably, truly,
Mhm.
not giving us an opportunity to put all of the cards on the table the way that we should have been able to, and then stop the hearing early. So it was a very big learning experience, that was exhausting.
Mhm.
I left that hopeful because of what we heard, because of what we did see happen, and the
Mhm.
testimony that was given and the exhibits that were allowed to be produced. That was, I think, the other thing, the other learning experience of what is a hearing officer going to allow to be
Mhm.
produced as an exhibit. Um, we had asked for the fidelity statement and evidence to support the intervention method to be provided to us as part of our, discovery. And they said, nah, it's not important. It's irrelevant to the case. I'm like, how?
Bad idea calls out the necessity of fidelity.
Exactly. I mean, so I think going into it, you have to know you're up against a huge
Yeah.
mountain. You know, it's a big hurdle, and you have to be okay with not prevailing, because you probably won't.
I think one of the most glaring things to me I didn't get to sit and watch all 3 days while it was live. I was watching like an hour here, 3 hours there, kind of a thing across. One of the most glaring things to me was what's the word that I want? The interaction between the people. There was definitely a different personal dynamic between the district staff and attorneys and hearing officer versus you and your attorney and the hearing officer. I mean, it was almost two completely different types of.
It was my attorney and myself on trial,
Right,
trying to justify why I wasn't crazy for thinking that she should have actually made progress.
right.
That's crazy, right? Why would you expect progress going to school? You know, and that's what it really came down to. We were the ones on trial.
Hmm.
We were the ones that were like at fault, if you
Right,
will, even questioning why, even though their testimony was telling us why we should ever have trusted them in the first place.
right. Definitely. And again, another one of the most profound things, and what a lot of your case hinged on was the disparity between the understanding of comprehension versus fluency. And, the constant harping of her comprehension is great. Her comprehension is great. Her comprehension is great. Her comprehension is great. It's like a broken record for 3 straight days. And you're sitting here going, fluency is a core foundation that plays a role in comprehension. Her comprehension may be great for, a second grader or a third grader, but that doesn't mean that it's true comprehension.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, where we are in our state specific, and their total disregard for IDEA. I mean, they are in corrective action, and I suspect that it's not even going to be okay. I mean, I suspect we will have some pretty significant fines coming still from the DOE, Department of Education, related to TEA's negligence and allowing all this to happen for so long. But that kind of feeds into the lack of understanding. Part of the corrective action was to train hearing officers. Well, they have
Mhm.
yet to prove that they've done that, despite all of us as constituents and taxpayers thinking that all of these things are happening, and they're not. The
Right.
hearing officers have no idea what they're looking at. And a district's going to testify whatever is going to help them not have to pay private school tuition. I mean, and that's very selective truth telling, if
Right.
and partial truths, because what we saw was not what should have been being done, but why it was justifiable that it was not sufficient.
And I think it's important to call out with that. How is your daughter doing in a private school that is geared towards the science of reading and dyslexia intervention? What is she struggled, she was regressing in public school, and now she's in a school specifically for her learning type.
Mhm.
How is she doing?
Amazing. Near miraculous is what I say at this point. We are unique in that I say a lot of times that with Olivia, it's just dyslexia. It's just the reading. We don't have a lot of the comorbid things going on, which is very rare, right? Most
Right.
students that have a specific learning disability or maybe have ADHD or have some other complicating thing. Now, we did have a significant bout with anxiety and depression at the hand of the trauma that we experienced in school. But since we have been supported in an educational learning environment that actually teaches, that has subsided significantly. That's no longer an issue for her. But this is, in all of my conversations with people and still trying to move the needle for Texas students, we started when the teacher, our Mr. Fokker, when that teacher was really concerned, we were about 6 months behind reading wise, right? So our district uses FNP, which we know is complete crap.
Fontes and Pinnell.
Sorry, which is total garbage. And you
Right.
have to actually do that benchmarking with Fidelity, which was never done with Fidelity. What I mean by that is that when you look at the expectations, you have the grade level, you have the letter expectation, and you also have a fluency level. And so when I think FNP says around level J, which is, I think that's the end of first grade, into second grade is when you start taking those fluency probes. Okay, so you have
I
to
just
get
remember what it is for the end of second grade, which
right.
is
You have to get to a certain level of FNP before they'll even do the fluency probes, but they have to be done.
Mhm.
For us, they were never being done. So here's this huge objective, truly much more objective measure that was never being done. So it was a haphazard. Yes, we can decode this level of word if we give her 6 hours, of course. I mean, we've got this kid with she's super intelligent. Sure, she can figure this out, right? So we start second grade about 6 months behind. We start fifth grade this year, and we had lots of different assessments that were the same, third party, neuropsych, school, all the things that said the same thing. She started fifth grade at a second grade reading level. So in 3 years, at the hand of gen ed dyslexia and special education IEP support, how much did we grow? Not even a year. If we start second grade 6 months behind and we start fifth grade at second grade level, we've made nothing.
Right.
But when we start in this amazing school that actually has teachers trained in the science of reading, trained the way children's brains learn how to read, she was at grade level well within the first semester.
Wow. That's huge.
It's huge. And not just, at this point, we're entering into private school, and I am rigid and skeptical and a progress monitoring crazy person because I have allowed this to happen on my watch, right? Like I feel very, as a parent, responsible for not being on top of it as I think I should have, right? Hindsight, we all have that, right? And so I'm asking them for data all the time, and bless them for just dealing with me and knowing that they were going to be able to make a change because they did what needed to happen. And they were just going to have to appease me until we were seeing it. But it really wasn't even the numbers that were coming home. She was reading signs, right? Like we're doing the commute to and from school, and she's reading signs she's never read before. She is reading menu items, unfortunately, now that I could always exclude if I didn't want that to be an option. Now she's reading the menu for herself. All these things that are the real life things.
Yeah,
and
no, they don't have mac and cheese. It's not on the menu.
no, there's only protein on this menu. No mac and cheese, no corn dogs, just good chicken or something. No, yeah. So so those things were kind of been a downer. But I'm watching her also read and making books book choices and hearing the change. We started this year, 5th grade. She was reading Puppy Place, which is a great series written at about a 2nd grade level.
Mm-hmm.
And now she's reading grade level appropriate books. Now the fluency I know is always going to be slower. Her rate is always going to be slower. And I'm totally cool with that.
Yeah.
But it's still way better than it's ever been.
Right.
And it's at grade level and with full comprehension. And she's able to stop and say, oh my gosh, Mom, what do you, he must have been thinking. And she actually is like that whole metacognitive thinking about what you're reading and making it the connections to yourself and to what your experiences have been. And then to be able to jump back in and continue reading with comprehension. Like those kinds of things, that's what I see. And spelling, they actually teach spelling. So we went from not being able to spell even sight words from kindergarten in 4th grade to, I think gladiator was one of our spelling words last week, and it was no big deal.
Oh, wow.
So it's a huge difference.
So I think you've covered a lot of this, but I still want to ask the question. So as a parent and as a pretty outspoken advocate at this point, what do you feel like were hands down your biggest learnings having gone through this process?
The biggest, the trust.
Like 2 or 3.
I think the trust, and I don't want people to go into this jaded. But I think that you have to anticipate, plan for the worst and expect the best. Truly. I mean, like, plan that you're going to have to go to due process and work to not have to do that. I don't think that, given the tone, especially of our educational system here specifically, that due process is a fabulous answer, unless you're talking about like major residential day treatment, something that's got a really high price tag, truly, because the cost emotionally and financially to go through due process is significant. And right now, because here in Texas, the statute of limitation is bunk and it's only a year, by the time you realize a problem is there and you try to work with anybody and you try to work, then you're out of timelines, you're out of statute timelines. And so you either have to decide you're going to do it and pull the trigger immediately when you decide you disagree, like right then or the day before, or just work really hard to avoid it. And although I say that, but I'm like, we worked very hard. And I thought we had a solid IEP and we just had lack of fidelity in the implementation.
Yeah. And because you called out the statute of limitations, and I would have looked it up if I had known we would hit on that, but within the Texas legislative session right now, there is a bill on the floor
Bill 1252.
Which one?
House Bill 1252.
That's it.
So what that's planning to do, if it approves, and if you're in Texas, you better contact your legislators because it is highly impactful to families, maybe not yours, but it will be your neighbor, to expand from our 1 year to the 2 years that is set forth. Most other states have 2, but that's what IDEA. I don't know if we've gotten along with 1 year, but it's Texas. They don't agree with IDEA anyway.
No, they don't. But please contact your legislators. Sorry, that's not a word I can say very easily. We definitely need that bill to pass if you're in the state of Texas. Make the phone call. Let's push this one through. But so there's one more question I want to ask you. And again, I think you've already said this, but I wanted to sort of highlight this particular answer. What advice would you give to parents who are considering or should consider due process?
That's loaded, Ashley.
Sorry.
No, but it's so personal, and not, I think right now, it depends where you are. And I know I keep saying it and I hate it because it shouldn't be this way. But until the tune of Texas education changes, I would avoid due process, even though the benefits are that you have the opportunity to impact case law, which is going to impact other people, go for it. If you are confident, if you're not afraid of the consequences, if you can go into it knowing that you probably will not prevail, right? And you are secure in the commitment of your emotions, of your finances, of whatever else needs to happen, go for it, right? You don't know, but you have to assume that you probably won't prevail. And if you do it, I would say from experience, go ahead and make it open, because you still, even if you don't prevail, have the opportunity to impact many families. I think that would be it. I think having an experienced attorney, ours was new, and I say that I don't know that it really would have mattered truly, because of the obvious relationship between our district's legal counsel and the hearing officer, which was palpable, right? Like you could just see
the
it. Relationship.
Yeah.
It would not have mattered. I could have had, gosh, I don't even know any famous attorneys, but like I could have had some monster famous attorney and it would not have probably mattered. So maybe that's another thing too, is maybe, just weigh your options as far as financially, like what can you afford and what's the outcome going to be?
Right.
There's just not an easy answer.
There definitely isn't. As your friend, I thought that it was incredibly brave. I admired you immensely for doing it and having the courage to make it public, because it is such a daunting thing. It's such a commitment. I definitely have the gumption to do it, but I'm like, all of the ramifications. I mean, you were talking about, you were preparing your son who's 4 years older, who's still within that public school system, how it may impact him. And I think that that's a critical piece for parents as well. The cards are definitely stacked against us in this state in a horribly unequitable way. I can't say that word apparently either. So,
well, and
but,
I think, and even not just in the state, because I think even, as we as friends and whatever have kind of learned since our experience, right? Which kind of, we got our hearing, the ruling at the end of December, not all that long ago, have still learned that there are districts that are doing way better. I mean, night and day better, and providing evidence-based intervention with truly trained interventionists, and not what we are experiencing here.
Right.
They actually do write goals for learning objectives instead of using accommodations. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the caveat too, is that, by and large, Texas has a lot of room to grow and to do better, but it all comes down, it's all Constitution too, right? Like the federal government gives all the states the authority, and then even further here, the state, we're all these little ISDs, so it's kind of even further self-monitoring and accountable, which sets up problems. But districts are doing it, and there are districts that are doing better. So
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I think we should wrap up. We're pretty much on the hour.
Okay. Time flies when you're having fun, right?
I know, right? So thank you for joining us today and going through this. I know that this isn't an easy conversation for you, but it's one that you're passionate about sharing. And I definitely know our community is grateful for that. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate all the effort DI is doing too, because it is a collective effort between parents and educators and staff that are wanting to do better and are willing to do better, to be able to do this as partnership, because that's the only way it's going to happen.
Agree. Completely agree. So to everybody in Texas, stay warm, stay inside.
Run the water in your pipes.
I almost melted last night. My husband had the heater on so high. I'm like, no.
Yeah, we don't have to melt to keep everything from freezing.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So But thank you, and everybody have a great weekend. And so Coffee Talk will be back next week with Peggy Stern of Super Deville. This episode remains on our Facebook page, and we will upload it to our podcast and our YouTube pretty quickly after this is over. So you can watch it Facebook, YouTube, podcast. It's all there.
Great. Well, thanks,
Everybody
Ash.
have a great weekend. Thanks,
Y'all have
Amy.
a good night. Bye.
Bye.